The city has a moment every day when the last of the light dies and the darkness takes over. It is not an instant transition. It is a slow, creeping rot that starts in the alleyways and underpasses, the places the sunlight avoids even at noon. It was 4:30 p.m. The rush hour traffic rumbled high above the bridge, but down here in the concrete canyon of the transit tunnels, the world was already deep night. The air was cold, thick with the smell of exhaust fumes, stale rain, and the metallic dust of the train rails. I was patrolling the maintenance access levels, a maze of pipes and rebar that runs parallel to the pedestrian walkways. My movements were silent, practiced. My long coat hid the heavy tactical armor underneath, but I was not disguised. I was simply invisible. I am always ready. I have to be. This is the hour when the weak believe the day's safety still holds, but the predators know better. They sense the vulnerability in the changing light. I saw her immediately. She stood out, a flash of white and blue against the grey concrete. Young, 16, maybe 17. She was wearing a high school uniform, the skirt too short for the cold, the kind of attire that broadcasts soft targets to the wolves. Her headphones were in, her head slightly down, making her oblivious to the environment, which was the first and most critical mistake. She was walking alone, navigating the winding pedestrian tunnel that led from the main transit station to the quieter residential area across the river. But it was her backpack that drew the eye. It was expensive, heavy, worn, a matte black military-grade pack designed for rugged survival or specialized equipment, not textbooks. She clutched the straps tightly against her chest, almost defensively. She was carrying something of value, or she believed she was. Either way, she had placed a target squarely on her back. 4 of them emerged from the shadows of a stairwell near the decommissioned ticket booth. Young, high on adrenaline and stupidity, but still dangerous. They were street dogs, not wolves, reckless, desperate, and armed only with the confidence that comes from operating in a pack against a lone target. They saw her, saw the backpack, and saw a transaction. Quick money for minimum effort. They moved quickly to cut off her exit, pushing her into the darkest pocket of the underpass where the security cameras, if they worked at all, were too far away to capture details. I stopped my movement and settled into the shadows behind a stack of rusted oil barrels. I checked my weapon, a compact, non-lethal delivery system loaded with specialized pain compliance rounds. I wouldn't need to fire, but I needed to be prepared for the escalation. My priority was the girl's safety, not my own engagement. I needed to wait for the moment of commitment. The tallest one, the leader by the way he walked, stepped into her space. He was shouting at her. His voice, amplified by the concrete echoes, was harsh, demanding the bag. The girl stopped, pulling the small white earbuds out of her ears. She looked at them. I saw her face. It was pale, but her eyes were steady. She wasn't hysterical. Not yet. Most victims crumble instantly, collapsing into tears and compliance. She had a cold defiance about her. She clutched the straps of the backpack tighter, holding it like a shield. The leader mistook her silence for shock. He reached out, grabbing her arm, trying to yank the bag free. That was the moment of commitment. The line had been crossed from threat to active assault. Just as the leader applied force, the girl spoke. Her voice was thin, almost a whisper, but it carried in the silence after the initial shouting. She didn't plead for her life. She didn't beg for mercy. She said something about her father, a warning, a threat aimed directly at their small, pathetic egos. She told them her father was coming. She said he would find them. She said he would make them regret this. It was a bluff, an act of desperate bravado intended to appeal to some sense of consequence they clearly lacked. But it carried the weight of a promise. The 3 lackeys behind the leader froze, momentarily surprised. The leader, however, threw his head back and laughed. The sound was ugly, echoing off the damp concrete. He told her fathers don't patrol the underpasses. He said the only people down here were forgotten. He said no one was coming for her. Then he applied brutal force, yanking the bag strap until the girl cried out in genuine pain. He was going to rip the bag right off her shoulder. That was when I moved. I didn't announce my presence. I didn't shout a warning. Words are negotiation, and this was past negotiation. This was a consequence that needed to be delivered immediately, brutally, and without recourse. I closed the distance in 4 long strides, my boots barely scuffing the concrete. I used the echoing acoustics of the tunnel to cover the small sounds I did make. They were focused entirely on the girl, distracted by their own cruelty and the leader's mocking laughter. The leader had his back to me, his attention locked on the struggle. The moment was perfect. I chose the largest target first, the leader. I was 50 feet away one moment and behind him the next. I grabbed the strap of the backpack he was pulling, simultaneously grabbing the back of his neck with my other hand. I didn't speak. I used the momentum of his own pull to spin him around violently. He was off balance, confused, his grip on the strap breaking. I slammed him back first into the cold concrete pillar. The sound of impact was a dull, sickening crack that cut through the silence of the underpass. He dropped instantly, collapsing to the ground in a heap, his body convulsing from the sudden neural shock. He didn't even have time to scream. The girl stumbled back, clutching the backpack, staring at the sudden violence. The remaining 3 thugs froze. They had been in the middle of their laugh, and now their leader was a motionless pile on the ground. They looked at the pile, then looked up at me. I was standing over the leader, my coat thrown open slightly, revealing the dark armored plates of my vest and the black mask covering the lower half of my face. The light in the tunnel was dim, but I let them see enough. I let them see the silhouette of absolute, unquestionable threat. Their eyes went wide. The confusion vanished, replaced instantly by pure animalistic fear. They were no longer the hunters, they were the prey. The tables had been turned with a speed that defied their understanding of the world. The second thug, a stocky male with a baseball cap, was the quickest to react, not to fight, but to run. He bolted, turning and sprinting back toward the stairwell, desperate to escape the scene of the sudden, brutal justice. I didn't chase him. Not yet. I had 2 targets still locked in place, paralyzed by the shock of the event. I took 1 step toward the 2 remaining thugs. That single step, slow and deliberate, broke the stocky runner's paralysis. He increased his speed, scrambling up the stairs. I needed to neutralize the 2 immediately, then secure the runner. The third thug, tall and thin, raised his hands instantly in surrender. He was whimpering. He was a non-factor. I ignored him and focused on the fourth one, who was still fumbling in his pocket. He was searching for a weapon, a knife, anything to restore his broken sense of control. He pulled out a box cutter, the small, useless blade clicking open. It was a pathetic gesture. I didn't use my gun. I stepped into his space. I grabbed his wrist, the one holding the box cutter, and twisted. I didn't need to break it. I just applied enough leverage to make the pain absolute. He screamed a sharp, piercing sound of agony and dropped the box cutter. It skittered across the concrete floor. I released his wrist. He sank to his knees, clutching his hand, rocking back and forth, sobbing loudly. The threat was neutralized. The leader was unconscious. The fighter was in crippling pain. The third thug was surrendering. The fourth was running. The girl was safe, still standing in the exact spot, holding the backpack, watching the scene unfold with silent, wide eyes. I turned my attention to the running target. He was halfway up the stairs. I pulled a small, compressed gas canister from my belt. It wasn't tear gas, but a high-density, low-visibility smoke deployment system. I threw the canister. It landed perfectly on the landing of the stairs. It hissed violently, instantly filling the stairwell with a thick, opaque cloud of white smoke. The runner vanished into the cloud, but I heard him stumble, followed by the dull sound of him hitting the wall and then sliding down. The smoke wasn't toxic, but it was suffocating and disorienting. He wouldn't be going anywhere for a while. I walked back to the 2 remaining conscious thugs, the one clutching his hand and the one with his hands raised. I reached into my coat and pulled out 2 sets of specialized flex cuffs, not standard police issue, but high-strength polymer that bites deep. I cuffed the third thug's hands behind his back tightly. I did the same to the box cutter thug. I wasn't gentle. I wanted them to feel the constriction, the absolute loss of control. I then knelt beside the leader, who was still out cold. I cuffed him as well. I checked his breathing, shallow but steady. He would wake up with a severe concussion and extreme neck pain, but he would live. My job is not to kill them. My job is to ensure they never forget. I stood up and walked over to the girl. She was still holding the backpack. She was shaking now, the shock finally setting in, but her eyes were still focused on me. She didn't scream, which was remarkable. She looked at my mask, at the armor, at the cuffs on the attackers. I knelt down, trying to make myself less imposing. I pointed to the leader's unconscious body. "This is the consequence," I said, my voice a low mechanical rasp through the modulator. "Tell me about the bag." She swallowed hard. She didn't look at the thugs. She looked at the floor, then back at me. She didn't ask who I was, she didn't thank me, she just answered the question. She said the backpack didn't contain money. It contained specialized flash drives, encrypted data. She said her father wasn't coming because her father was the reason the gang was after her. Her father was the one who had sent her to deliver the drives, the one who had set her up as bait. She said the data was proof of corruption, proof of a massive financial fraud involving the construction company that owned the docks, the construction company that controlled the transit lines, the construction company that controlled this underpass. I felt a cold wash of realization. This wasn't a random robbery. This was a targeted hit. The girl wasn't just a victim of street crime, she was a casualty of white-collar war, and her father, the one she had used as a shield, was the one who had put her in the line of fire. I looked at the bag again. The matte black high-grade pack. It wasn't expensive for a student. It was expensive for a courier. I reached out, my hand moving slowly. I gently took the bag from her hands. It was heavy. It felt right. "Your father used you," I stated, the realization solidifying in my mind. "You risked your life for him." She nodded. Her eyes were suddenly empty. The defiance was gone, replaced by a terrible realization of betrayal. "They were supposed to get the bag, but they weren't supposed to hurt me," she whispered. "They failed." I looked at the 4 neutralized thugs. They had failed not because they were stopped by the father, but by a force they didn't even know existed. I had stepped into a mess much deeper than I initially thought. I looked toward the stairwell where the runner was still coughing and gagging in the smoke. I had to secure him. I couldn't leave him to report back. I turned back to the girl. I reached into my coat and pulled out a clean, heavy blanket I keep for victims. I draped it over her shoulders. "Go up the stairs," I commanded, pointing toward the crowded street where the police patrols operate. "Find a phone. Tell the police you were assaulted. Do not mention the data. Do not mention the backpack. Your father is no longer your problem. I am." I handed her a small, waterproof packet. Inside was a tracking chip and a note with an anonymous number. "If you are followed, if you are contacted, use this." She looked down at the packet, then back at me. She finally asked the question, the one that needed no answer. "Who are you?" I didn't answer. I just looked at the 3 cuffed thugs, then at the thick smoke coming from the stairwell. The sirens were distant, but they were coming. My time was up. I had to disappear. I needed to secure the runner and the drives. I turned and walked toward the smoke-filled stairwell. I was moving into the trap to retrieve the last piece of the puzzle. I could hear the runner still struggling, his voice raspy with coughs. I was going to find him, neutralize him, and then I was going to disappear with the data. The girl was now free, but she was also alone, and her problem had become mine. The bag was heavy in my hand. It was more than just data. It was leverage. It was power. It was the key to taking down the construction company that owned the transit lines, the same company that had been running illegal operations out of the docks. This was connected, all of it. The man who hurt the homeless veteran, the councilman, the construction fraud, it all came back to the power structures in this city. I had the smoking gun in my hand, and tonight I was going to use it to blow the lid off the entire operation. I reached the bottom of the stairs, stepping into the dense chemical smoke. My mask and filters protected me, but the sudden density swallowed all light. I activated the infrared vision on my helmet. The world turned into shades of green and red. I saw the runner. He was curled up against the wall, dry heaving, his hands over his head. He was done. I moved fast, cuffing him quickly and thoroughly. 4 targets neutralized. Mission complete. Now, for the escape. I looked back down the tunnel. The girl was gone. She had followed my instructions. The path was clear. I had the bag, the data, and 4 cuffed thugs for the police to find. I climbed the rest of the maintenance ladder and reached the access tunnel above. I replaced the grate and secured it. From here I could travel 3 miles underground, moving entirely unseen to my emergency bolt hole in the old industrial park. The weight of the backpack felt reassuring. It was heavy with the truth. I started walking. The silence of the underground tunnel broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and the distant, muffled wail of sirens growing closer to the underpass. The police would find the thugs, the girl would tell her story, and the investigation would begin. But the core evidence, the drives, was safe. It was in my possession. And now, the game had moved to a new level, the high-stakes game. I reached the bolt hole. It was a single-room maintenance shed hidden beneath an old textile factory. slated for demolition. Inside, I had a custom-built workstation, encrypted and powered by a generator. I set the backpack down on the steel table. The first order of business was to analyze the data. I pulled out my decryption gear. I was running against the clock. If the father knew the data was compromised, he would have a team looking for the girl and the bag already. I had to be fast. I attached the flash drives to the decryption unit. The screen lit up with code. This was the silent part of the war, the methodical, invisible part. This is where I find out who the real enemy is. The drives contained thousands of files, financial ledgers, offshore accounts, internal memos. The fraud was staggering, involving kickbacks, shell companies, and inflated contracts all linked to the city's transit system. And there was a name that kept appearing, Pierce & Sons Construction, the same company linked to the warehouse and the councilman. The conspiracy was a single monstrous entity with multiple heads. This was the root of the rot. I found a file labeled Operation Cleanup. It was a contingency plan, a list of targets to be neutralized if the fraud was exposed. The girl's father was on the list. He was disposable. The daughter was not listed, which was why they had tried to intercept the data before she reached her destination. I found the name of the girl's father, David Hayes. He wasn't the heroic figure she painted. He was a low-level accountant who was trying to save himself by exposing the operation. He had used his daughter to run the data. His betrayal of her trust was unforgivable. I spent the next 3 hours mapping the connections. The web was intricate, but the center was clear. Arthur Pierce, the CEO of Pierce & Sons. He was the architect of the fraud, the man who controlled the councilman and the police contracts. If I wanted to dismantle the operation, I had to hit Pierce directly, and I knew how. I found blueprints for Pierce's personal penthouse residence, which was currently undergoing a specialized, highly secure renovation by his own company. It was less a renovation and more a bunker. That would be my next target. I needed to get inside. I needed to expose him in a way that couldn't be buried. I looked at the backpack, then at the city map on the wall. The war was officially on. The girl had given me the weapon, and now I had to use it. I had to become the monster that frightens the monsters. I powered down the computer. It was time to move. The data confirmed everything. Arthur Pierce was the architect of the fraud, the man who had monetized the city's infrastructure and corrupted its elected officials. He was protected not by luck or incompetence, but by money, reinforced concrete, and fear. My analysis of the stolen drives provided the blueprints for his new residence, the penthouse atop the Pierce & Sons corporate tower. It wasn't an apartment. It was a fortress disguised as luxury. Biometric scanners, reinforced titanium doors, smart glass that polarized at the flick of a switch, and a dedicated, highly trained private security team operating from the floors directly below. This was the spider's lair, and if I was going to kill the web, I had to be inside. I spent the daylight hours developing the breach plan. I didn't rely on brute force. I relied on systems failure and psychological dominance. The information from the girl's backpack was the master key. It contained the digital signature of Pierce's lead security architect, a man named Henderson, who was now listed on Pierce's Operation Cleanup Kill list. I used the signature to craft a complex digital ghost key. This would allow me a one-time bypass of the biometric and coded locks. The primary challenge was the altitude and the external security grid, which was monitored by thermal cameras and motion sensors covering the entire facade of the tower. I would have to approach from above, using the storm that was forecast to roll in just before 3 a.m. as my cover. The ritual began as the city went dark. I shed the anonymity of my coat and put on the gear. Every piece of armor, every pouch, every tool was a calculated variable in an impossible equation. I wore magnetic induction gloves and used a specialized grappling harness. I moved through the service tunnels again, exiting near the corporate tower. The building was a monolith of cold glass and steel, standing defiant against the sky. I used the neighboring construction scaffolding to gain altitude, then launched my grapple toward the roof access ladder of the Pierce Tower. The ascent was slow, meticulous. The wind howled and the first sheets of rain hit the glass facade, providing the necessary acoustic cover. I reached the roof access point. The main door was secured by a 5-inch titanium bolt and a multi-factor lock. I didn't touch it. I moved to the rooftop HVAC unit. I used thermal cutters to remove a section of the steel grating on the vent shaft that led directly down into the penthouse unit's utility closet. The smell of conditioned air and ozone rose from the shaft. I dropped into the darkness. I descended 30 feet, the specialized harness muffling the sound of the line running over the metal ductwork. I reached the bottom and landed silently on the carpeted floor of the utility closet. I was inside the walls of the bunker. The first obstacle was the utility closet door, which was secured with a coded lock. I didn't enter the code. I attached a small, specialized EMP burst device to the panel. It delivered a precise, localized surge, enough to momentarily scramble the lock's internal memory without triggering a hard alarm or affecting the building's main power grid. The lock clicked open. I moved into the penthouse. The air was warm, filtered, and smelled of expensive cedar and dust. The contrast between the grit of the transit tunnels and this obscene luxury was jarring. I moved through the service corridor. I could hear the faint, rhythmic beeping of the security systems. The interior was silent. Arthur Pierce was either asleep or in the secure core of the apartment. I bypassed a retinal scanner using the ghost key, a small device that projected a synthesized retinal map of the security architect. The door hissed open. I stepped into the main living space. It was a cavernous room dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city. Pierce wasn't there. The apartment was pristine, empty. I moved with calculated speed toward the master suite. I found him in his private study. It was dark, save for the glow of a dozen monitors built into the wall. Arthur Pierce was sitting at a glass desk, wearing a silk robe, working. He had the arrogant posture of a man who believed the world was his spreadsheet. I moved to the door and engaged the magnetic lock, sealing us inside. He didn't hear the lock. He didn't know I was there until I was standing directly behind him. I didn't make a sound. I let my presence register in the cold air. He flinched. He looked up, his eyes widening from the monitors to the shadow standing over him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The primal fear was evident on his face. He saw the armor, the mask, the threat that defied logic and security protocols. He scrambled back in his chair, knocking a crystal decanter off the desk. It hit the carpet and didn't break. The only sound was his shallow, panicked breathing. "Who are you?" he finally managed, his voice thin and shaky, entirely stripped of its corporate authority. I didn't answer the question. I never do. I walked to his desk. I took the small, high-capacity flash drive I had taken from the girl's backpack and plugged it directly into the main terminal on his desk. His face went white as he watched the monitor screen fill with the data he thought was gone. "The files," I rasped, my voice synthesized and low. "The drives your thugs tried to steal, the proof of your corruption, the list of the innocent lives you ruined for this view." I gestured toward the massive windows. He was trembling. He stammered something about lawyers, about connections, about the police. He was appealing to the system he controlled. I ignored it. I initiated the script I had prepared. The terminal began a massive broadcast. I wasn't uploading the data to a generic site. I was routing it directly to the email addresses of every major federal investigation unit, every rival media outlet, every international non-profit with an interest in financial crime. The transfer was encrypted and irreversible. The truth was out. The shield of silence was broken. "The police are a system you bought," I continued, pacing slowly behind his desk. "But I am the consequence you forgot to budget for. Your money means nothing here." I looked down at him. I saw the fear in his eyes was turning to desperate rage. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed, leaning forward. "You're a criminal. You're alone. I will put a price on your head that will bring every killer in the country down on you. I will dismantle your life." I tilted my head, acknowledging the threat. I pulled a small, laminated photo from the tactical pouch on my vest. It was a picture of the girl, Sarah, taken from the data drive. Her school photo. I laid it on the desk next to the computer. "You sent men to hurt her. You used your thugs to steal her innocence. Her father betrayed her," I stated. "I am not her father. I am the justice he failed to deliver. And now, I am your problem." Pierce stared at the photo, the implication hitting him like physical force. He had underestimated the cost. He hadn't just lost the data, he had gained a ghost. Then the lights in the study flickered violently. The monitors went dark. The silence returned, but this time it was heavy, dangerous. The broadcast had been completed, but the power failure was not part of my plan. It was an anomaly. Pierce looked up at me, a cruel, cold smile spreading across his face. "How you think you're smart?" he whispered, regaining a sliver of his composure. "You think you found my flaw, but you just walked into the safest room in the city. The blackout is mine." I realized my mistake. The renovation wasn't just security. It was a failsafe. Pierce had independent systems designed to trap intruders if the primary systems failed. The magnetic lock I had used was overridden by a full security lockdown. The penthouse was now a sealed steel box. And there was a new sound. The heavy, rhythmic thump of boots on the ceiling directly above us. Pierce's private security detail, likely alerted by the brief overload when I initiated the broadcast, was rappelling down from the roof. I had moments. I sprinted toward the wall of windows overlooking the city. Pierce shouted at me, ordering me to stop. I grabbed a heavy glass statue from a nearby table and smashed it against the smart glass. The glass didn't shatter. It spiderwebbed, but the impact was absorbed by the reinforced polymer. The bunker was holding. I was trapped. I moved to the ventilation system access panel behind a bookcase. It was small, but large enough for a quick escape. I used a titanium crowbar to pry the access panel open. The hinges groaned under the pressure. I heard the muffled commands of the security team right outside the study door. They were breaching. I had seconds. "You're not going anywhere," Pierce yelled, rising from his desk. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small chrome pistol. He was shaking, but his intent was clear. He was going to shoot. I didn't engage the weapon. I didn't want the sound of gunfire inside the secure room. I threw a flashbang directly at the study entrance. The charge was low yield, designed for disorientation. It detonated with a sharp pop, just as the door began to hiss open. The flash and sound provided the cover I needed. Pierce flinched, covering his eyes, momentarily blinded by the light. I vaulted onto the desk, slamming my boots down on the glass. I ripped the data drive from the terminal. I grabbed the heavy crowbar and struck the exposed vent shaft opening. The metal groaned and buckled. I dropped down, disappearing into the dark, narrow ductwork, just as the security team, 4 massive men in full tactical gear, burst into the room. They were disoriented by the flashbang, yelling into their comms. I was crawling through the ducts, the noise of their commands fading above me. I was moving through the core of the building toward the service elevator shaft. Pierce would be screaming orders, demanding they find the breach. I wasn't worried about them catching me in the ducts. My problem was the endpoint. The shaft would lead to the lobby, which was now sealed. I needed an extraction route that defied logic. I reached the end of the duct, looking down into the massive, echoing service elevator shaft. It was hundreds of feet deep. I had to go down. I attached my grapple line to the cable housing and initiated the freefall descent. The cable whirred as I dropped, controlling my speed with the friction brake on my harness. I was a dark streak in the concrete column. I passed floors of panicked employees who were rushing to the fire escapes due to the false alarm I had initiated on the lower floors. The chaos was my friend. I reached the bottom of the shaft, landing silently on the roof of the stationary service elevator car. I cut the line. I opened the hatch on the elevator roof and dropped into the control compartment. I manually overrode the system, taking control of the elevator car. I didn't need to go to the ground floor. I needed to go to the subterranean parking garage, the only place where the public systems intersected with the secure corporate systems. I guided the car down to the 3rd level below ground. I stepped out of the service elevator into the cold, silent depths of the executive parking garage. This area was empty, reserved only for Pierce and his inner circle. No cameras here. They relied on biometric entry. I knew the layout. My car, a nondescript reinforced sedan I used for transport, was waiting, parked perfectly in a spot I had paid an attendant to use days earlier. I sprinted across the concrete, my boots echoing in the emptiness. As I reached the car, I saw the reflection in the polished hood. 2 men, behind me. They hadn't come from the elevator. They had come from the stairs, or a hidden access door I hadn't seen. They were not Pierce's security. They were smaller, faster, dressed in plain clothes but carrying suppressed weapons. Cleaners. The kind of professionals who show up when the mess is too big for local security. The kind of men who don't talk. They were sent by the greater power, the one that controls the cartel and uses Pierce as a figurehead. They were here to ensure the data, and me, were eliminated permanently. I spun around, drawing my secondary weapon. They didn't hesitate. They opened fire. The suppression made the sound flat, deadly, like heavy hammers hitting metal. I rolled behind a concrete pillar. the rounds tearing chunks out of the structure around me. I returned fire, aiming low, forcing them to take cover. This wasn't the police. This was a direct lethal threat. This was the consequence of pulling the thread too hard. I was now on the run from a professional assassination squad. The game had just escalated again. I had to get out of the garage, and I had to do it now. I initiated the remote detonation sequence on the tires of my own car. The small explosive charges I had placed earlier went off, blowing out all 4 tires and filling the garage with the sound of splitting rubber and compressed air. The car dropped instantly, creating a temporary metal shield. I used the smoke and the chaos to sprint toward the exit ramp. The assassins were disoriented by the sudden noise and the failure of my supposed escape vehicle. I vaulted over a low wall and scrambled onto the back of a delivery truck parked near the ramp. I needed a distraction. I reached the outside and dropped from the truck, melting into the shadows of the alleyway behind the corporate tower. Sirens were wailing nearby, the police finally arriving at the penthouse. The corporate world was crumbling around Arthur Pierce, but his hired killers were still hunting me. I was outside, but I was exposed. I had the data, but I had no sanctuary. I knew where I had to go. I had to find the girl, Sarah. The threat to her had just become my priority. If I was the only one who knew she gave me the data, she was safe. But if Pierce's goons had seen her face or tracked her father, she was the primary loose end. I needed to make contact. I needed to ensure her protection. I had given her a tracker. I pulled out the small device to ping her location. The screen glowed green. She was moving, away from the city center. Good, but not fast enough. I ran toward the docks. I had to intercept her before the killers did. The night was far from over. I ran through the city's network of forgotten infrastructure, using the shadows and service lines to put distance between myself and Pierce's assassins. They were professionals. They wouldn't rely on random pursuit. They would be checking transport logs, traffic cameras, and known escape routes. They would know about the transit line fraud and the associated rail yards. I was counting on that. The tracking chip I had given Sarah showed her moving slowly, almost aimlessly, toward the abandoned train yards on the south side. She was running blind. I had to get there first. I drove the custom motorcycle, pushing the silent electric engine to its limit, navigating the back streets with reckless precision. The wind whipped at my exposed skin, but my focus was absolute. Every second I saved was a buffer for her life. The cold, logical part of my mind was already planning the final confrontation. The rail yard was a perfect battle space, open ground for visibility, but plenty of heavy cover, shadows, and acoustic traps. I reached the rail yard perimeter and ditched the bike behind a derelict water tower. I scaled the rusted fence and dropped into the yard, moving low between the dead rail cars. The area was silent, dominated by the howl of the cold wind whistling through the empty freight containers. It smelled of rust, diesel fuel, and dry weeds. The tracker showed Sarah was hiding inside an old abandoned locomotive engine near the center of the yard. I moved toward the engine, my suppressed weapon held ready. I scanned the perimeter. No movement. The assassins weren't here yet, but they would be. They were too efficient not to converge on the most logical rendezvous point. I reached the locomotive and peered inside the dusty cab. She was huddled on the floor, shaking, her face streaked with dust and tears. She was holding the heavy backpack to her chest, even though it was now empty. I stepped inside. She flinched, stifling a scream, her wide eyes instantly recognizing the black, armored figure that had materialized in front of her. She didn't mistake me for her father this time. She knew who I was. "They're coming," I rasped, my voice low and urgent. "The cleaners. They know you have the data. They know you are the last loose end." She nodded, unable to speak. I walked to the window of the cab and looked out over the yard. The setting was perfect. The sun was dipping below the horizon, bathing the yard in long, treacherous shadows. "You need to get out of here," I commanded. "Now! There is a tunnel 200 yards east of here. It leads to the highway overpass. Go there. Do not stop. Do not look back." I pointed the way. She hesitated for a moment, then scrambled to her feet. The survival instinct had returned. As she slipped out of the cab and started running low between the train cars, I heard the subtle change in the air pressure, the faint wisp of suppressed movement that told me I was too late. The assassins were here. They had flanked me, using the cover of the long shadows and the rail cars to approach silently. They hadn't come for the girl first. They had come for the target they knew would be there. Me. I slammed the heavy steel door of the locomotive cab shut just as the first rounds impacted the metal, pinging off the thick steel like stones. They were using high-velocity, armor-piercing rounds. I couldn't stay in the cab. I moved to the back of the locomotive and burst out onto the roof of the fuel car. I was exposed, but I had a vantage point. 3 targets, one positioned behind a stack of railway ties, one flanking from the north, and one climbing onto the roof of a nearby freight car. They were smart. They had me triangulated. I needed to break their formation. I pulled 2 flashbangs from my vest. I tossed one toward the stack of ties and the other toward the freight car roof. The twin explosions were sharp, disorienting cracks that echoed across the yard. The one on the freight car stumbled, falling hard onto the metal roof, dropping his suppressed weapon onto the tracks below. The one behind the ties flinched, grabbing his head. I used the 2 seconds of confusion. I vaulted off the fuel car and sprinted toward the nearest cover, a large empty freight container. I used the corner of the container as my shield. The third assassin, the one flanking from the north, had recovered and was firing rapidly, the rounds impacting the thick metal inches from my head. I didn't engage with gunfire. I didn't want the noise to draw local police or interfere with Sarah's escape. I waited for him to pause his magazine change. The click of the empty magazine was my cue. I burst from cover. I reached him in 2 bounds, hitting him low and hard with my shoulder. We both went down, rolling across the rough gravel. I disarmed him instantly, grabbing his weapon and tossing it far into the darkness. I locked his arm in a joint hold, twisting the limb until I felt the resistance of tearing muscle and ligament. He screamed, a muffled sound of pain, and went limp. 1 down, permanently disabled. I looked up. The freight car assassin had recovered and was moving along the roof trying to get a clear shot. I sprinted toward the crane track that ran above the yard. I grabbed a hanging chain that was secured to a hoist hook and swung outward, using the chain's momentum to propel myself toward the freight car. I slammed into the assassin on the roof, sending us both tumbling across the slick metal surface. His head hit the sharp edge of the roof access hatch with a sickening thud. He was out cold. 2 down. The final assassin, the one I had blinded with the flashbang, was still staggering near the railway ties, trying to clear his vision. He had a shotgun, a close-quarters weapon. He was firing blindly, the heavy slug tearing through the air, hitting a nearby water tank. I moved low, using the rail lines as cover, closing the distance rapidly. When I was within 10 feet, he saw my silhouette and tried to aim. I didn't let him. I leaped, tackling him to the ground. He dropped the heavy shotgun. I pinned him with my knee on his chest, grabbing his head. I slammed his face once hard against the steel rail. I didn't need to check. He wasn't getting up. 3 down. The professional threat was neutralized. The price was paid. I stood up, breathing heavily, checking my body for new injuries. A few scrapes, a minor bullet graze on my shoulder plate. Nothing that slowed me down. The silence returned, heavy and final. I had dismantled the attack. I didn't look back at the bodies. They would be found. The complexity of the scene, the high-grade weapons, the tactical precision, would further complicate the investigation, proving to the world that Pierce was involved with a serious criminal organization. I moved to the tunnel entrance where I had told Sarah to go. I used my flashlight to scan the area. She was gone. She had followed my instructions. I pulled out my tracker. The green dot was still moving, now approaching the main freeway. I pulled out my phone and dialed an anonymous, secure contact, a lawyer with connections to an international human rights NGO I trust. I disguised my voice and gave the coordinates of the freeway overpass. I told the lawyer there was a young girl waiting, a witness to a major corporate crime carrying information vital to a federal investigation. I told him she needed anonymous, permanent protection, and a new life. The lawyer asked for no names, no details. He knew my signals. He knew the cost of failure. He would secure her. My part of the mission was complete. The girl was safe, the evidence was distributed, and the threat was neutralized. I walked back into the silent rail yard, retrieved my motorcycle, and rode toward the city lights, but not toward the center. I needed a new sanctuary. As I rode, I listened to the news feed on my comms. The reports were chaotic. Arthur Pierce had been arrested at the penthouse, charged with conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. The evidence I had broadcast was irrefutable. The company was collapsing. The councilman was under investigation. The system, once shielded by money, was tearing itself apart under the weight of the truth. I found a new base in the derelict shipyards near the outer harbor, a vast, decaying warehouse that offered solitude and endless blind spots. It was cold, damp, and perfectly invisible. I set up my minimal equipment, a cot, a monitor, my tools. I was tired, profoundly tired, but I couldn't rest. I sat at the temporary workbench, looking out at the city skyline. It was beautiful from a distance, a beacon of light and false hope. But I knew the rot beneath the surface. I picked up the challenge coin, the scale of justice. It was tipping slowly, painfully, toward balance. I had saved the girl. I had exposed the monster. I had delivered justice that the law could never have achieved. But the assassins were a message. The operation was larger than Pierce. There was a higher power, the shadow organization that had hired the cleaners. They would be sending more, stronger, smarter, less forgiving. I am alone. I have no father to save me. I have no police force to back me up. I have only the armor, the training, and the righteous anger that burns like a cold fire in my chest. The girl had her father's name, but I am the consequence that came when he failed. And as I stared at the city, I knew my war was not over. It was just entering a new, darker phase. I was the shadow they didn't believe in, the monster that hunted the monsters. And tonight I would sleep for a few hours, because tomorrow the hunt continues.